Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Matt Mowers, Joe Grogan, and Jason Miller.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Beautiful day in Budapest. My name's Matt Mowers. I'm the founding board member of the EU-US Forum, and just as proudly was senior advisor in President Trump's State Department in his first administration. And we're just thrilled for everyone to be here. I'm joined by my fellow board member, Joe Grogan, who had served as director of the White House Domestic Policy Council in President Trump's first term. Of course, Jason Miller, who served as a longtime senior advisor and continues to advise the 45th and 47th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And let me just tell you quickly about why we started the EU-US Forum about a year ago, just over a year ago. We had our kickoff event in Rome with Vivek Ramaswamy and the ID Party. And part of the idea was we needed to foster this policy dialogue on both sides of the Atlantic. And because if you had looked at the state of the world in both Europe and the United States in early last year, you had unchecked migration and politicians who were doing nothing about it. You had an attack on free speech that we continue to see throughout the European Union. You had government bureaucrats going after our tech innovators who were trying to foster that open community of dialogue. You had energy policies that were actually creating national security crises for both the United States and for the EU. You had farming policies that were trying to run out family farmers because of the radical environmentalist policies that we were seeing, and yet there were limited opportunities to push back on that. And what we saw was that the results of, we did extensive polling in a bunch of different countries in the run-up to the EU parliamentary elections last June. What we saw was that Europeans were seeing things a lot of the same ways that Americans were. They were truly fed up by this permanent bureaucracy and this permanent political class that wasn't responding to their needs and their desires every single day. We asked the question about, do you think there should be additional checks on migration? And over 70% of respondents in almost every single country said yes. We said, are there too many restrictions on free speech because of regulations coming out of Brussels? Over 60% of citizens said yes. And what it showed us was that people were fed up with the status quo. And so we saw a growth in conservative results in the EU elections. We saw growth in conservative performance in France. We saw growth in conservative performance in Germany. And of course, we saw incredible growth in performance in the United States when we elected Donald Trump last November. And so we want to continue that dialogue. We want to make sure we're continuing to foster that discussion on both sides of the Atlantic to make sure that we not only stop the bad ideas, but promote a lot of good populist conservative ideas that are once again responsive to the citizens of their own country and not responsive to just some sort of bureaucracy, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or Brussels. And so thank you again for joining us. I'm happy to turn it over to my fellow board member, Joe.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be up here with you again. It's a privilege for me to ask questions of Jason Miller. He is one of the most well-regarded and brilliant communications specialists active in Washington, D.C. He had a critical role in President Trump's 2016 campaign, again in 2020, and the most recent victorious campaign in 2024. For those people who don't know him in Washington, D.C., everybody who knows anything about communications considers him one of the best in the business. So, Jason, I want to go right to free speech issues, since that's your bread and butter. This Biden era, and I'd say really during the tail end of the Trump administration, was a really dark time for free speech. There was a lot of censorship on the part of big media. We've seen accurate scientific information get censored by big tech and by social media platforms, and of course by the mainstream media. And when you're looking across the Atlantic from the United States, we're often surprised by some of the criminal prosecutions that are taking place both in the UK and on the continent. Do you think that President Trump is going to make free speech a critical issue for him? And can we, then those of us who value free speech, hope to see progress moving forward?
Yes, well, good morning, and thank you for having me, and Matt and Joe, thank you, and to the EU-US Forum. It's a true honor to be here in Budapest and have so many of you wake up this morning to come and listen to us have our conversation. Free speech, don't just take it from me, but free speech is a massively big deal here in the EU, as well as even in the UK, obviously no longer part of the EU. But just to give you an example, here's this week's edition of The Economist. Not exactly the most right-leaning publication on the planet. I subscribe to it, so you guys don't necessarily have to. But as you see here from the cover, Europe's free speech problem. This is The Economist. This is not one of our right-of-center friends or people who necessarily have a partisan ideological bent that's favorable. But again, Europe's free speech problem. This is something that everybody realizes is huge. And the reason being is because what happens with the EU, what happens with the UK, what also happens with free speech in the United States all impact each other. I'll go give you a couple of reasons why. Because once you start seeing the prosecution in some cases, we saw a woman in the UK be sentenced to 31 months for a completely stupid tweet that she put out. By that you can't go and say some of the horribly offensive things that she said, but she took the post down. She apologized, but again, there are people who are. Rapists and murderers and all these things that you look that don't have 31 months in prison necessarily. But you see also the creep from the EU as they go and try to find backdoors and ways to get at free speech, which then ultimately impacts the United States. And to give you an example, this is again more the UK than the EU. But one of the things that the UK is trying to do right now is they're trying to get, for example, a backdoor into Apple's iCloud. So think about this for a moment with the UK. The UK government is telling the United States that if Apple still wants to continue doing business in the UK, that they have to give access to iClouds. And of course they say it's only to stop the worst of the worst, is to stop the bad actors. Well, I can tell you that anyone in the US intelligence side will tell you, will say that if you open up people's individual iClouds, just, and again, they come with a very nice, well-presented cover that it's only the bad people that they're looking at. It'll take hackers and other people 5 minutes tops to hack into everybody's iCloud. Dangers like this become very, very real. Now, the other thing that we see is under this guise of just protecting people, that really what this is try to stomp down on any aspect of free speech, whether it goes to maybe say the pro-life movement, whether it goes to the pro-democracy movement. Free speech has to be defended. I think on the American side, we very much take for granted our First Amendment right. There's a reason why it's number one, the freedom of speech, because other countries don't have a First Amendment in the exact same way. In fact, you'd be surprised how many Western countries really have no true embedded constitutional right to free speech anywhere within their, effectively their charter. And so free speech is critically important. What happens on one side of the pond impacts what happens on the other side of the pond. And I think for the president, part of the reason why he's going to be so vigilant on this issue is what we saw happen to him. Of course, toward the end of the first term in 2020, we saw the media and big tech companies collude, which that's what it was. It was outright collusion to stop coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, which, as we all found out, was 100% very true. We knew it at the time. Everyone knew that Hunter was corrupt, and so was the Biden family, and these were all these business deals and such that they had. But we saw the restriction of free speech. We saw President Trump deplatformed from free speech efforts. And some of you may or may not know, but I launched a free speech social media platform after President Trump's first term in office that quickly became the fastest growing social media platform in history. We built it up to about 10 million users before I left in early 2023 to go back and work for President Trump for his most recent successful campaign. So free speech is an issue I've been passionate about. I think it's something that President Trump is going to be addressing, both as it comes to the EU and even the UK. And I think we're just getting started in this debate.
On that point, you talk about when you founded that social media platform. Jason, I remember, and this wasn't in the EU, but we've seen examples like it in the EU. You were down in Brazil, actually, at one point, and they actually didn't like some of the things you were saying, and they detained you on your way out of Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? And what lessons could we learn from that experience that we now see, whether it's the woman who's being jailed for 31 months or whether it's the folks in Germany who aren't able to express their own opinion right now? Because you talk about how the First Amendment really is, our free, right to free speech really is so we can't take it for granted. You saw that kind of firsthand in a lot of ways. What experience can you draw from that you think we need to make sure the EU understands as well?
Yeah, and what I didn't have the full appreciation for is how this will be the weaponization of government, the weaponization of the legal system against free speech. That's really what it comes down to. So in 2021, I went to CPAC Brazil, had a great time. We hosted a reception to kick off the social media platform. President Bolsonaro is on the platform, as well as his adult sons, Eduardo and Flavio, and Carlos were all on the platform. Went and visited President Bolsonaro at the presidential palace. Someone snapped a picture, put it on the front page of the Follow de Paulo. And when I went to the airport then the next day, some folks met us and said, "Oh, Mr. Miller, we'll go and take you to your plane," which I was like, "Wow, this is really nice. I guess I'm a VIP now." But then they led me to a room that said Police. I was like, "Okay, this is. I don't think this is the VIP lounge." And I sat down, and they started grilling me on why you're here, what are you doing? And I was, well, I was a guest. I was attending CPAC Brazil. Obviously, I proudly call myself a Bolsonarista, supporter of President Bolsonaro's. But I said, I'm a guest in your country. I've certainly done nothing wrong. What's the issue? And they handed me a 50-page document in Portuguese and said, if you just sign this document, you'll be free to go. And I've seen enough episodes of Law and Order to know that you don't go and sign these things as, okay, well, hold on, this doesn't seem right. And I asked them to walk me through what they were saying. They went and had to get a lady from baggage claim who spoke good English to do the translation. I said, again, when you have a lady from baggage claim doing the translation, I don't think this is necessarily an up and up. So let's go and call the embassy. Let's go and call President Bolsonaro and his office. But effectively, what it was just one big brushback pitch that they didn't want anyone who's going to come to Brazil and talk about free speech. Now, Brazil, again, I don't want to get too much in the weeds because we're here talking about the EU, but since this is a global free speech conversation that we're having, in Brazil, the Supreme Court does not operate in the way it does, say, in the United States, where you imagine 9 people in black robes who sit there and look very regal and then make decisions a couple times a year. The Supreme Court in Brazil, they effectively have their own investigative force. They get to file their own prosecutions. They get to try you. And then if you don't like the outcome, well, guess what? Tough luck, because they're the Supreme Court. So it's really, they're the judge, jury, and executioner, not just figuratively, but literally as well. And what they wanted to do is just have a chilling effect on anyone who supported free speech from ever coming to Brazil. And we see the exact same Supreme Court justice who detained me, became an international news story, excuse me, is the exact same one who is now filing charges against former President Bolsonaro. And so when you allow these people this unchecked power to restrict free speech, there's an agenda. There is an agenda at play. And especially as you see the rise of populism, you see whether it be the Reform Party in the UK and in the EU, when you look at the rise of, say, AFD, next door in Austria is the FPO having big gains. You see a number of pro-sovereignty, populist based political parties have more and more success. I think you're going to see government regulators, particularly the ones in Brussels, who, again, the difference here is everybody knows many of these decisions aren't being made by individual countries. What they're being made by are the bureaucrats who are in Brussels, who are unelected. They're unaccountable to anything that's happening, as any backlash, and they want to snuff out any aspect of dissension or free speech. We all must be united against fighting back on what these bureaucrats and technocrats in Brussels are trying to force down the throat of the sovereignty-loving people in all the nations of the EU.
Let's beat up on Brussels a little bit more, shall we? The Digital Markets Act. So this has been used to go after both Apple and Meta, 2 huge American companies that dominate their spaces. I think Apple was fined over $500 million and Meta over $200 million. Do you see this as sort of a bargaining chip that the EU is exploiting in the trade talks, or is this transcend that as a threat to American dominance in this space? And do you see it linked to the speech issue, or how should Americans view it? How should people who want to defend their homegrown companies, regardless of what member state they are in the EU?
Yeah, another great question, because I see the assault on the major, not just social media, but the digital advertising companies it's partly a trade tool. It's part of a brushback pitch on that, but I also think it's intentional and direct effort to try to suppress free speech. It's just another way for Brussels to control the way that people communicate, what issues they're actually allowed to comment on. And effectively what they would like, and I'm saying that the EU, the leaders, the people actually work there and put the rules and procedures into an actual implemented policy. They want complete government control over this. And it's quite horrific what we see the EU doing, their assault on American tech companies. And I think that you're going to see the United States and President Trump make this a very big deal as far as we move along in trade negotiations, which, by the way, you do notice that finally the EU started getting a little bit smarter in the way that they're negotiating with President Trump. And so now they're coming to the table. There was obviously the extension that President Trump gave. But the EU is probably taking the most aggressive anti-Trump positioning, I would say, of any of the major trading partners, although maybe now, with them coming to the table, that can change and we can actually find a way to work together in a much better capacity.
You know, Jason, I think you and I joined the Trump campaign in 2016 around the same time, and it was right after Brexit. Right, I remember a lot of folks were trying to draw comparisons of what we saw happen in the UK with the Brexit vote to what might happen that November. We saw that play out. We've seen kind of the resurgence of conservative parties growing on both sides of the Atlantic, certainly like we were talking about with the election of President Trump in 2024, the growth of conservative parties in Poland. We actually saw the Law and Justice candidate, the conservative candidate, edge out in the first round of voting, and they've got a big runoff election this weekend, actually, in Poland, and so there's another opportunity for conservatives to do well. What are some of the things that you did with President Trump to cut through the media, to cut through the noise, to get your message directly to voters that maybe conservatives here in Europe could learn as well, as we're beginning to try to break through and try to ensure that there's conservative victories on both sides?
Yeah, a critical component of this is to make sure that, especially if you're in the center-right space, or if even if you don't consider yourself overtly partisan, but just someone who loves free speech, is to help support and build the ecosystem of folks who are challenging the authority or the traditional media construct. So I'll give you an example. It's not just simply a matter of the traditional left of center news outlets. Even when you look at many of the so-called center or so-called center-right publications, take Bild, for example, in Germany. People outside of Germany, or I'd say people in the United States, typically think of Bild as being the one more center-right or free speech-friendly outlet. Not at all. I mean, Axel Springer, really, there's some bad people. And they're the ones who now own Politico in the United States. I'll tell you, when I was running the social media platform, we tried to advertise with Bild, and again, Germany, I believe, was our fourth or fifth biggest market. And we had a simple platform of free speech. There was, obviously, we did not platform or allow for, say, hate speech or things were crossed into things that everybody would find objectionable. But to the folks at Axel Springer and Bild, they said, no, we're not interested in working with you. You cannot advertise with us. Well, what I found out later is their CEO was narked out by one of their senior executives who said, nope, they view you as a Trump guy, which, I mean, obviously I am a Trump guy. But they said simply because of that, they don't want any advertising from you. They don't want to promote any aspect of free speech. So when you think of the Politico of the United States, when you think of Axel Springer, they are the exact same people who would not allow, say, for example, a free speech platform to advertise with them simply because they do not actually support free speech. So what we need to do, and I say this is kind of my life coach aspect of the free speech debate, is to make sure that we're supporting and building on folks who are, when I say alternative media, I mean people outside of the traditional news mainstream. We have to build them up. We need to support them. I know we have folks here from everything from Human Events, Daily Wire, Washington Reporter. We have a number of, in the United States, other outlets, including whether it be Breitbart, which I have some very good friends, or National Pulse, which is another great website run by Raheem Kassam, Steve Bannon's War Room. And of course, there are many more outlets that are in the EU and the UK. Support and build up these outlets as truth tellers, people who are able to make some of the tough commentary here, because there has to be a diversity of opinion. The far left political viewpoint is represented every day in the mainstream media. There needs to be a balance People need to realize that there are additional perspectives, and it's incumbent upon all of us, everyone who's here, everyone who believes in free speech, to make sure that we platform and build up these alternative channels, because what we find out is that for the regular public, that's where the actual viewpoint is. People are tired of the unchecked mass migration. They're tired of the overlords in Brussels telling the sovereign nations of the EU what they can and can't do. And people say, I didn't vote for you, I didn't elect you, but you're telling us what's in place. And likewise in the United States, when people look at the mainstream media and say, who are you to shove this down our throats?
I can't stay away from Brussels. So let's go back to those guys, because I love it when you call them out. So the corporate sustainability, what's it called? The EU's corporate sustainability, I think, due diligence directive talks about environmental sustainability, net zero goals, things like that. Now, Trump was really vociferous in the first term around energy dominance. Now we're talking about energy supremacy and cheap energy abundance for American citizens. Watching Germany go down this road with pursuing net zero, abandoning nuclear, becoming dependent on the Russians, all things that are obvious to average Americans and anybody who knows anything about this stuff, and which Trump was so clear about, but they embrace this ideology over and over again. Same thing in the UK, pushing traditional energy out of their solutions matrix to get citizens and companies, business, or get them abundant energy. Where are we going to go with this? Is this going to be a priority for the Trump administration, both for economic partnership, but also national security for the West and the United States? How do you see this playing out over time? And again, back to the speech issue, can we sort of expose this, those of us who understand how stupid net zero is? How do we get this message out? And do you think there's any cracking going on over this? Because it's been so dominant, and we've done so many suicidal policies in pursuit of net zero as the West.
Yeah, and another great question, by the way. Net zero is absolutely crazy. I like walking. I'm not going to walk to work every day. I like going out for bike rides on the weekend. I don't plan on riding my bike to work every single day. That's effectively where the eco-loons want to take us. They want to, I don't even think they'd allow us to have a horse and carriage anymore. I think it'd just be you can walk or ride your bike. But energy security is economic security. It is national security, and here's why. Let's take Germany, for example. I'm beating up on some of the crazy left in Germany enough today. But as we saw in recent years, especially under Schultz, they go and they shut down nuclear plants, they shut down the coal plants, and what then they find out is that all of their energy then is coming from Russia. And then we have Russia illegally invading Ukraine, and we wonder why then Germany is beholden to Russia for energy, and why that relationship is so testy and problematic. And so Germany's actually had to go and reverse some of their policies to diversify some of their energy. The other thing too is because when then it drives up energy costs, then you're not going to have the foreign direct investment in countries such as Germany if energy is sky high and through the roof, and if everyone is then reliant on Russia for all their energy. Now, obviously that's a challenge, say here in Hungary, where they need to have additional energy diversification. I know it's a little bit more challenging here, just in the way that Hungary is the neighborhood that we're in, and the way who all they're surrounded by. But ultimately, when countries are so impacted by energy regulations like this, then they don't have the money maybe to spend on things such as defense. Things are just way too expensive, and which again makes us weak as allies, all being able to sustain ourselves in that nature. I will say that in some of the examples that is, we haven't talked about France much, but I think France, with their approach to nuclear, has it right. I think that's something in the U.S. where we've been in extreme disadvantage because we've shunned nuclear for so long. Now we're starting to have some of that come back online. I think we just opened up our first new nuclear reactor in the U.S. for voice, I think the last 3 or 4 decades. So it's been quite a bit. I know there are a couple others on the way. I think some of the SMR, the single module reactor technology, some of the mini nuclear reactor sites, for lack of a better description, I think could be the solution in many places. And by the way, not just in the US, but I think other places in Europe, even as we talk about Africa, Southeast Asia, the whole SMR approach, I think would be very, very smart. But you know, I remember I asked my oldest daughter's now 16, I think, asked her 3 or 4 years ago where electricity came from. And it was some version of, well, the wall. You plug it into the wall, and as boy, I've failed as a parent. I need to get the home education going a little bit better. But no, energy doesn't just come from the wall. It comes either from coal or from nuclear or something else of that nature. And so, if we're going to meet the demands, the energy increase demands for, say, AI or continued growth of the electric vehicle market, then we're going to have additional nuclear power. That's the only way that we're going to do it. And I would say that France and some other countries that have larger nuclear power footprints, I think, is very, very smart.
You know, it's you talked about the left wing in Germany, and I think one of the things we've noticed, both here in the EU but also in the United States, is that the left wing supports democracy except for when the outcome isn't what they want it to be. You saw that in France, where you saw Macron's party partner with the far left to try to prevent Marine Le Pen's party from gaining any seats in the most recent National Assembly vote. You saw that after the makeup of the EU, when we had this great growth for conservatives in the EU elections. They actually maintained the status quo in the leadership. You're seeing it where AfD is being shut out continuously in Germany, despite having record number of votes cast for them. And we saw it in France, and we certainly saw it in the United States, that when they don't get what they want at the ballot box, they turn to the courts and they try to delegitimize political leaders. What are the lessons you learned in the 2024 campaign, working with President Trump as he's going through those court cases, as he's going through those trials, as he's fighting not just a political campaign, but also a judicial system to try to come back? What are the lessons you learned there? Because you're seeing the same tactics that they use in the United States now here in the European Union to try to shut out conservative voices.
Yeah, another great question. And what I found is that all around the world, again, this could be in the United States, this could be in Brazil, this could be in the UK, this could be in the EU, but this whole notion of a deep state conspiracy isn't some far-fetched theory. It's very in your face. It's the legal system. And the last line of defense for the extreme radical left is the legal system in every respective country, kind of Western-facing country in the world. That's their line of defense to push back against people who believe in sovereignty. The people who live in Hungary should very much believe that Hungary first. Same thing with Germany, Germany first. France, France first. And U.S., America first. People should be able to embrace the sovereignty and individuality and the rights that they hold as citizens of their respective nations. That shouldn't be ceded just to some far-off bureaucrats in Brussels. That shouldn't be ceded to unelected technocrats that there's no accountability for. They should absolutely be supportive of what's driving their futures. But when you see these courts be absolutely out of control, they're not even trying to hide it. It's very much in your face. They want you to know that they have the ultimate power and they're going to stick it to you. And I think the only way that we stop that ultimately is with the sunlight, which is always the best disinfectant, is that we talk about both the use of social media, the use of media platforms that aren't part of the mainstream media to tell the stories of how our courts are being weaponized against our own citizens.
Hungary's been sort of an island of common sense and conservatism in the EU during the Obama administration, close ally during Trump's first term, and then again facing just unrelenting attacks from the Biden administration. When J.D. Vance goes to the Munich Security Conference, the mainstream media was aghast at his commentary and the way he delivered that message. But privately, I heard from a lot of European friends, like, thank God this message is finally being carried forward, and thank God for the way he did it, too, that it was so bracing. Do you think, going back to this cover from The Economist, that the European elite is ready to start listening to some of the message that Hungary has been trying to carry forward and which JD brought forward in Munich? Is it even, if they're not saying so publicly, Are they privately whispering? You're in a lot of capitals on a regular basis and meeting with a lot of these guys across Europe.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point because especially prior to coming to Hungary, I was in the UK for the last 5 days, and many of the conversations would start off with, "Oh my gosh, did you see the vice president's remarks in Munich? And I can't believe they took the proverbial blowtorch to folks at the security conference." And then, but he's kind of right in what he's saying, and that's exactly it because if we're going to be strong as in the West, then we're going to have to go and actually invest in our security. And what you found is almost immediately countries started laying out their plans to start moving towards that 5% expenditure of GDP on defense. And even you take a look at, say, countries such as Germany, who, by the way, have said we need to start rebuilding our domestic military industrial base so we can actually start producing things again. And so I think that the outcome was good, and good for Vice President Vance for having the courage to stand up and tell it exactly as it is. Obviously, I'm an unabashed fan of the Vice President, a big supporter. But when you look here at the Prime Minister Orban, he's doing a fantastic job. And I think it's a real story. And some of us, Americans, were talking last night about how safe we feel when we're in Budapest. How there's a sense that this is a place where you don't have to watch your back. You're not worried about having your pocket picked every 5 minutes like some other countries in the EU. And I think that the Prime Minister has done a great job when it comes to sovereignty issues. I think he's kept the country safe. And back home in the U.S., we'll have the media always will refer to the Prime Minister as, say, a strong man, or he's someone who's very much like President Trump. He's a strong man. He's tough. I'm like, well, you seem to be criticizing the Prime Minister. What is it that he's done that's so horrible? And usually that's followed by, well, he stopped the unchecked. These are my words. He's effectively stopped the unchecked mass migration, primarily of Islamism, and unvetted illegals entering the country. And boy, he's just so tough on that. And I'm like, well, that sounds like a good thing. That sounds like someone who, if I was a citizen of that country, I'd vote for them. I'd say good for him for stopping some of this unchecked Islamism and mass unvetted migration that you've seen really change a lot of other countries. And we all remember back to 2016 when President Trump talked about his friend Jim. And by the way, Jim does exist. I've actually met Jim. I just didn't know at the time, but the president says, my friend Jim goes to Paris once a year and comes back and says, Paris isn't Paris anymore. It wasn't until I really started spending a lot of time in Paris in 2021 and 2022 that I then understood exactly what President Trump meant, where Paris isn't Paris anymore. And you see, whether it be the graffiti, you see the roving gangs, you see the lack of assimilation for people who've come to the country, whether it's legally or illegally. And so good for Prime Minister Orban for putting his foot down, for defending the sovereignty of Hungary, for protecting the people of Hungary. And again, obviously not someone who votes in Hungary, but I think it's very impressive what the Prime Minister has done, and I think he definitely deserves another election here. And I think he really should be looked at as a model for how you can keep your country safe.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it shouldn't be underestimated how much Orban's leadership and his message gets appreciated among conservatives and in the Trump White House, both in term one during the campaign and in recent visits when I've been back in D.C. and done meetings in the West Wing, whether it's family policy that's being referred to and questions getting asked about it, immigration policy, and just the way he operates and speaks his mind. It's a very interesting dynamic to see a small country with a leader that displays such courage that it's noticed among a lot of different people. So I think that, it's difficult to quantify, but Hungary gets mentioned disproportionately in conversations in Washington, D.C. Maybe more, for pound, there's no question any country in the world, Hungary gets referred to more than anybody else.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why these policies matter, not just for Hungary, but for the United States. I mean, elections have consequences. And so I would say that anyone who is not paying close attention to Hungary and doesn't realize the importance, and I know this isn't necessarily a political rally for the Prime Minister, but someone who I very much support, you take a look at what one election can do. So take, for example, the United States after Joe Biden was certified as the winner after 2020. Joe Biden allowed into the United States, think about this, 2 Hungaries worth of illegal immigrants coming into the United States in a 4-year period. Think about that for a moment. 2 Hungaries. That's a lot of people of unchecked, unvetted, illegal migrants coming into the United States in one 4-year stretch. If you don't think that the Prime Minister's opponents won't do the same thing, then you have another thing coming. I think that sovereignty is important. I think we have to defend it. And again, by the way, I think from all nations of the EU should be looking to defend their borders and to make sure that they're able to keep their people safe. It's the first rule of government. If you can't keep your people safe, then there's no purpose of even having the government.
Well, and it's funny because the way you say it sounds like such common sense, but if you go back 8 years ago, how controversial all of that seemed, right? I remember when I was at the State Department, it took us a while to get some new political appointments in place, and so we'd have the Hungarians come in, and you'd have these career State Department officials who just want to browbeat them on everything. They'd say that their policies were xenophobic. They'd say that they were racist. They'd say all these things, the same exact words they would use to describe Donald Trump in 2016 and his policies in 2016, which is nothing more than their way of trying to fearmonger and try to elicit emotion out of people to try to continue this unchecked migration that we saw. But Jason, you were part of a team that really kind of turned that paradigm on its head, similar to what we've seen here in Hungary. What are some things we can talk about how we were able to galvanize support from the American people, and now we've seen support from the European Union based upon the polling we saw on the issue of migration?
Yeah, another good point, because going back to my earlier commentary about the need for additional media outlets for free thinkers, for people who want to make sure that the public is getting the truth, if you're someone who's running a campaign, whether it's in the United States, whether it's here in Hungary or in the EU, you have to build these additional channels so people realize that there are a lot more folks who think like them than they might realize. Because you can go through any country in the EU, and if you just read the whatever the largest mainstream newspaper is, or follow the largest television channel, you will think that your position is somehow an outlier that's off to the side. But what you realize is the actual conventional wisdom that people do want safe streets, they want secure borders, they want to make sure they have industry in their own countries, they want to make sure that that decisions are made regarding the economy and their livelihoods aren't by some unnamed elected suits in Brussels. And I would say, going back to talk about the EU again, where I think there's a real lack of respect for sovereignty of people in their respective countries, is I think that the whole issue of sovereignty to many in Brussels seems to be limited to the Champions League. That, well, yes, you can be proud of who you are when it's football season. Well, guess what? It goes a lot more than that. It goes to cultural identity. It goes to cultural heritage. We have countries that have been around for, in their current form, hundreds of years, in various forms for well over 1,000 years, and people should be able to have pride and respect for their own heritage and their own culture, and quite frankly, even their own religion.
When you think about the Trump administration's current relationship with the EU and how, let's say, we'll call it fraught for a second, that he definitely appreciates the Europe, individual countries, but I think the EU as an institution, as a bureaucratic body negotiating against him, there's significant tension right now. You think that the United States and the EU can get beyond this to work on issues of common interest, whether it's countering Russian aggression and bringing peace in Ukraine, countering China, or is it hopeless? Does the Trump administration need to go country by country, or can the EU bring itself to accept the fact that Trump is right on so many of these issues?
Well, when it comes to President Trump, I never count him short on anything, because, as we saw before, he brought peace to the Middle East. I remember even 2016 when we were campaigning and he said that he was going to get it done. Obviously, I'm a good team player. I'm going to say, okay, at that time, Mr. Trump, now Mr. President, sure, let's give it a whirl. We'll see what we can do. I never thought it was possible in a million years that he'd bring peace to the Middle East. He did it. I do think that he can help repair that relationship with the U.S. and the EU, because ultimately the EU are very important partners. I've been very tough on the EU here. And the reason being is that we have so many great countries in Europe that have been longtime allies of the United States, that we've worked together in a critical fashion, whether that be to save the free world from the First World War, the Second World War, to help bring freedom to hundreds of millions of people following the fall of the Iron Curtain. I mean, look exactly where we are in Hungary and the freedoms that people now have. As you talk about reversing things where there had been essentially the Stalinist property grab here in Hungary back following the end of World War II, but now with the fall of the Iron Curtain, we have freedoms here in Hungary that hadn't existed before. These are important allies. My concern, again, are the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels who pretend to make the decisions on behalf of sovereign people, on behalf of sovereign countries, that we need to find a way to work together better. And I think this is the reason why President Trump has been so aggressive, that he realizes we have a finite time window to go and help get the EU back on course, to get some areas of commonality if we're going to maintain this special relationship, if we're going to maintain freedoms when it comes to the Western world. Obviously that there is a counterbalance to people who do not believe in freedom, who believe in socialism and communism, or in the case of some of the unchecked migration, Islamism. We need to make sure the EU and the US have to have a good relationship. You'll see President Trump being not so shy about saying that he doesn't believe that many of the EU countries have upheld their end of the bargain when it comes to security type issues. But we're in this together. This is for the future and the fate of the Western world.
You know, you talk about NATO spending, and Hungary actually has always stood out as an example of one of the few NATO countries that's actually been meeting its NATO commitments of 2% and growing. Continued investments in its own defense manufacturing base. I think the rest of Europe learned a lesson in the last few years that they were hamstrung not by just their regulatory problems coming out of Brussels, although that is a huge issue for them. If you look at the collapse of Germany's auto sector in a lot of ways and the slowdown growth there, but also their lack of investment in their own defense manufacturing base. Any lessons that we can discuss, I mean, whether it's how the United States invests in its defense manufacturing base, how Hungary does it, to ensure that they're prepared for additional aggressive acts from other actors in the region, things like that. Lessons that can be learned from there.
Yeah, I'll tell you the number one lesson is that if we do not have a wake-up call through EU countries and even in the United States, everyone better start learning Mandarin. That's just the example. You look at what's happening in Germany's auto base, and although I see one person in the audience who actually can't speak Mandarin, but is one of the good guys, probably the only person here who does speak Mandarin. But you look at Germany's auto manufacturing base. It's been completely gutted. People don't realize just how problematic it is for these state-subsidized EV operations to come in, and it's happened right under the watch of Germany's leaders. You look at what China's efforts are with their debt diplomacy. With the Belt and Road Initiative sounds really nice until you wake up and find out that even as a European nation, that you have been effectively economically colonized by the CCP. That's scary. This isn't some again, some novel theory. This is what's happening. When you see the way that China has expanded their telecom, you talk about Huawei. Many of the nations have gotten smart and said, Huawei, we don't want you to be running our telecom or our 5G or things of that nature. But in a lot of countries, they've allowed that, and so it's not just a matter of if we're facing the immediate folks who hate freedom and are more socialism or into Islamism. It's also the threat of China. And so all of the EU nations better wake up before it's too late.
Do you see Trump maybe making the Trump administration, including Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, imploring Europe to even spend more on defense spending and maybe some more integrated partnerships as far as purchasing is concerned, some commitments together to increase defense spending?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think many of you saw that there was recently the UK was able to connect with the EU on their defense fund, so there could be some joint partnerships with regard to that. I think you're going to see as Germany started saying that they needed to up their spending and try to rebuild their military production base. Actually met with some folks in London who are from various countries around the EU who want to start talking about things such as a Joint Production Act, a JPA, to start figuring out how the Europeans and U.S. can combine on critical defense tech initiatives. Because again, the whole nature of national security and defense is changing, as we've seen even in the war in Ukraine. The different technologies, the different styles of things that are being used. Actually, Rana Foroohar from the FT had a great column the other day about exactly where is the additional defense spending happening. What aspects of it are we ready for this next generation of national security? But no, I do think that the call to get to 5% spending of GDP is something that many of the countries are already on their way. One thing we have to make sure is that some of the countries it's artificially inflated because of the war that's happening inside of Ukraine right now from the Russian invasion. We have to make sure that they don't backslide whenever that war eventually comes to an end, that it's not just temporary, but these nations are putting their money where their mouth is and being ready to help defend themselves, quite frankly.
You know, something else that I think the Prime Minister Orban was on the cutting edge of in a lot of ways was actually talking about how there were other actors trying to destabilize politics in their own country, right? And I think what we found out, and certainly what we've probably known for a while, but has been illuminated in the last 4 months since President Trump took office, is that often it was USAID grant recipients and others that were trying to, be the ones who stoked the fires against certain types of governments just because they didn't like them, just because they disagreed with them ideologically. What are some additional things? I mean, obviously, we've seen the reforms that are happening with USAID, the strong line that the Trump administration has been taking so far. That ties in really with what President Trump has talked about protecting national sovereignty, making sure that nations are choosing their own destiny and not having their destiny chosen for them by a bunch of outside funders. Anything else that you think the Trump administration may do to ensure that is codified? And given that one day there might be another Democratic administration, there might be other liberal actors. You see Soros out there consistently funding entities around the world trying to impact and destabilize governments. Things that people should be looking out for, or maybe some additional actions the Trump administration could take.
Yeah, and this is one where I think Secretary Rubio is playing a critical role in making sure that freedoms are defended all around the world. You see this with regard to free speech. You see this with regard to the support of having democratically elected people in countries all around the world. To see his strong stances when it comes to places such as Venezuela or Cuba. And so good for Secretary Rubio for really having that forward-facing pro-freedom aspect. One of the interesting things as we saw the weaponization of government, the weaponization of the justice system against President Trump in the 2024 election, is that Democrats, it's so great because you just know in the United States that when they're trying to take the high horse on these of trying to be virtuous, that it's the exact opposite. But when all of our polling down the home stretch of 2024, when you ask the question, who's the threat to democracy? It was Democrats. The American public saw what was going on. They realized that, because that was the whole thing that Democrats, one of their big themes against President Trump is that he's a threat to democracy. What people realized is when you're leading with your chin like that, there's actually the Democrats, whether it be the lawfare, whether it be what they're doing to try to suppress free speech. You saw the Biden administration just outright telling social media companies what they could and could not have on their various platforms. So President Trump, I think, is going to be really the torchbearer for sovereignty, for freedoms, for make sure to help people. I think Secretary Rubio is another shining light in that regard. And I think one of the bigger messages that you're going to see from this administration is not the United States showing up and say, we're from the U.S. and we're here to help. It's going to be the U.S. showing up and say, we're from the United States and we're going to help you help yourselves. And I think that that message of self-sufficiency, of protecting democracy, protecting freedoms, and then also making sure that in whatever generations or administrations are to follow, that nations have been able to look out and provide for themselves in a way that's not dependent then fully on the United States or Brussels to do for them.
How do you see the trade conflict settling out as we move forward here? You saw we just signed a deal with the UK. We're still in this period of tension with the EU. As you alluded to earlier, Trump had threatened to increase the tariffs significantly. The EU responded by saying, okay, no, we're serious. We understand you're serious now. We'll fast track it. Does this even out at roughly 10% with the EU? Are there certain industries that are going to be controlled? How do you see this playing out over the long term?
Yeah, great question, because it all comes down to both the tariff and non-tariff barriers that we see in these countries. So, say for example, on autos, I mean, effectively the auto tariff rate against the United States-produced automobiles is about 4 times higher than it is for cars coming into the U.S. But it's these non-tariff barriers. I mean, talk about, say, livestock, agriculture, the things of that nature. It's in many places it's effectively banned or made it impossible to import, and they'll cook up excuses on various countries or in various folks in Brussels will do it to say, here's why you can't have, say, meat or certain vegetables, things like that from the U.S. So these non-tariff barriers are really critical, and so we have to go and see some of this open. So it'll be both the tariff component, it'll be the non-tariff component. Of course, you see the VAT is effectively just another tax. So it might not be considered directly with tariffs, but that's also a barrier, making things much more expensive for American goods being sold. And so we want to have a two-way street. I think President Trump is going to get it to a place where it's a much better relationship. But the thing to keep in mind with President Trump is that unless he somehow gives me permission to go and try to change the Constitution in the next few years, this is his last term. I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also if he were to run again, I'd be ready to roll with him. I mean, you can't do 3 and then sit out the 4th, so of course I'd be back. But the president knows that we have a finite time window, and it's not just because of his time in office, but it's because we're running out of time as Western civilization to get things right, with the growing threat of Islamism, with the growing threat of the CCP and these dictatorial natures. We have to take advantage of this time right now, and I think he realizes the urgency of doing it. I'm glad to see the reaction from the EU of finally saying, you know what, we are going to come to the table, help get some of these deals. We saw with the UK, we know that we've heard the Treasury Secretary Besant, U.S. Trade Rep Ambassador Greer has talked about whether it be Japan, Korea, India, a number of other countries that are very close to having trade deals done. I think this will be good. I think it'll be good for the U.S. I think it'll really help the long-term relationships of our respective nations.
Well, I think we've got time for maybe one last question, Joe, if you've got one, and then Jason, any wrap-up thoughts you have after that? Although we've had a lot of covered a lot of ground here in a quick period of time.
This has been a great conversation. We've jumped around a lot, and you've covered a lot of ground. I just want to get back to your personal experience with Trump and where he is right now. You were on the campaign in 2016 when the dominant narrative was, there's no way this guy has a chance to win. I think there were 21 other Republican candidates or 20 other Republican candidates when he started, then 2020 and now. What's his mood like? How would you mentioned he senses the urgency. How about if you want to share any personal reflections of where he is as far as his headspace and his approach to the job, finishing his 3.5 years?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing is just the manner in which President Trump won in 2024. Winning the popular vote, 312 electoral votes, 77.3 million votes around the United States. President Trump was given a mandate. I think he's taken full advantage of that mandate to make the real changes. And you always get asked the question, of course, there's a bit of a recency bias, but who the greatest presidents in history are. I think that you can say with regard to President Trump that he's easily the most transformative president that we've ever had in our nation's history. The way that he has been able to put the working men and women back in the focus. There's actually, believe it or not, there was a really good New York Times story that ran over the weekend. And yes, I actually did say that. There was a really good New York Times story, although that'll probably come back to bite me. But it's Shane Goldmacher and a couple other folks who wrote up how President Trump has truly changed the voting patterns of the Republican Party in the United States. He has made the Republican Party the party of the working class. Quite frankly, you see it here with Prime Minister Orban, how he's really stood up and fought for the working class, because really ever since China's entry into the WTO, which again was a disaster, even going back to, say, in the U.S. a decade earlier with NAFTA, that the people, the globalists, the people who effectively make all of their money from paper being traded on Wall Street, the ones who've seen their incomes, their worth go up and up. But if you're someone who works an hourly wage, who has to get your hands dirty, who has to maybe drive or commute longer than an hour in each direction, you've essentially had it flat. And that's even if your industries are still around. Maybe your industries have already been sent off to Asia or to other countries, and you've completely lost that. So the transformative nature that President Trump has had in really making economic populism cool again is something that I think he's done in a way that ultimately will benefit the working men and women, not just the United States, but of the EU and of the free world, can really save people from what's happening of the two divided aspects of society, of the haves and the have-nots, because everybody should be able to have.
Well, thank you for that, and I think that's a great note to wrap up on. Really appreciate, Jason, your insights, your sacrifice to support our country as well in the United States, and to share some of those ideas here in the European Union. I know. Why don't I just ask you, is there any other wrap-up thoughts you have? Any topic we haven't covered you want to talk about? Otherwise, and then we'll turn it over to Andrew Romeo for a few housekeeping items as well.
Yeah, I just want to say in conclusion, thank you very much to the both of you, to Jim, to Matt, and the EU-US Forum. I think this is great to have people together. I appreciate everyone coming and listening to what we have to say. I think the EU-US relationship is critically important. I think it's something that we have to get right, unless, as I said before, unless we want to be overtaken by Islamists, or unless we want to be taken over by the CCP from China. This is about Western democracy. This is about the freedom of Western thought. And we all have a voice. We have a vote. And this is the time that we can do it with the rise of technology and the defense of free speech. So if you care about this, you have to make your voice heard. It is up to every single one of you that's in this room. It's up to us to make sure that if we're going to maintain these strong relationships, that we do it by making our voices heard. So on that note, I would say thank you very much.